Welcome to Transformational Pathways, a podcast created by Toastmasters District 46 in the greater New York area, where we share conversations from influencers within the Toastmasters community and people whose lives have positively transformed by walking down the Toastmasters path. Whether you're just getting started in your career, have had recent career changes, or you're navigating different languages, we're here to help you build confidence by discovering new tools, overcoming your fears to find your voice, and engaging in a thriving community. Enjoy today's episode.
Hello! Welcome to another episode of Toastmasters District 46 Transformational Pathways podcast. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and walking the pathway with me today is our guest, Matt Kinsey. Matt has been a Toastmaster for years, but most impressively is the sitting first vice president of Toastmasters International itself. Matt is also the president of MK Tech Group, which is an IT consultancy firm focused on IT infrastructure. Matt's also involved in Business Network International in his hometown of Coral Springs, Florida. Matt, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Scott.
Let's just start with some terminology here. First vice president of Toastmasters, $5 words. What do you do with Toastmasters? Explain.
Well, I'm on the board of directors for Toastmasters International. And as first vice president, I'm an executive committee member, which is the 5 officers of the organization. What that means is this coming August, I'll become the international president-elect. And then in August of next year, I'll become the international president for 12 months.
Are you excited about it?
I am. It's a vision I've had for quite a while. And when you start to see that come to reality, that's always fun. You know, it's been interesting this year because the weight of the organization slowly starts to fall on your shoulders. And I've been interviewing international director candidates. And one of the things that popped in my mind is, wait a second, these candidates who are being elected this year, they'll be on the committees that I assign when I'm international president. So all of a sudden, the weight of that decision about who I want to vote for and who I think will serve our members best becomes a little bit more significant to me.
Wow. You said it's a vision that you've had for a while. Talk to us a little bit about that. How did you first speak? Well, let's go back even further than that. How did you end up in Toastmasters?
It's actually an amusing story. I was working for a company some of you may have heard of called Office Depot. It's the second largest retail office supply chain after Staples in Boca Raton, Florida. And one of my coworkers came to me and handed me a little flyer to come visit Toastmasters at lunch for a lunch and learn. Now, this wasn't my first invitation to visit Toastmasters at Office Depot, but it was the first time they were giving me free food. And I'm like, hey, I need to eat lunch. Let me go check this out. And when I walked in, I observed the meeting, and I've got to be completely honest with you. The speaker they had that day wasn't really that good. Now, I understand now why that was. But at the time, I was like, this is what you're showing me. But then I saw the evaluation, and I went, oh, wait a second. I realized what they're really doing. And immediately I realized what they were doing is helping build the speaker's self-image, build their significance, understand the power and the importance they have in the world. And I was like, I need to be part of this for 2 reasons. One, I knew I needed to be better with feedback, both giving and receiving feedback. I tended to be very dismissive of feedback I got, especially positive feedback. And I got in trouble with that a few times with my supervisors, because they'd be like, yeah, wait, you know, I go out of my way to give you a compliment and you're like, no big deal. You know, just say thank you. But more importantly, I had a problem with giving evaluations because I was really good at finding every single flaw. Yeah. But I wasn't really good at lifting people up. And in fact, I was kind of in trouble for the last round of evaluations I'd done. And when my supervisor sat in with me on the next round of evaluations, to observe me and see if I'd learned better. He walked out after the first one, and afterward he's like, "Where'd you learn that?" I was like, "Toastmasters." I said, "I learned how to evaluate in Toastmasters." So that's how I got involved with the organization in 2003.
What phase of your career were you at when you first joined Toastmasters?
I was a mid-level engineer on the infrastructure side. So I was what was called a desktop engineer. And I was responsible for deploying software and managing the desktop computer environment at the corporate office in Boca Raton, which was about 2,000 employees. We didn't have to deal with the stores. There was another complete team that dealt with the stores. But Toastmasters actually led to my promotion because we had we had a virus attack. And as the lead desktop engineer, I got called in to figure out how do we get rid of this thing. And I'm sitting there in the room with my manager, my director, the VP of Shared Technology Services, the Chief Information Officer, and a couple other people, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to attack this. And the conversation was going around, and I looked at the CIO whose office we were in, and I said, "Can I draw something out on your whiteboard?" And he goes, "Sure." So I start drawing. I'm not paying any attention to the conversation. And I turn around, and I realize that everyone is looking at me. And the CIO looks at it, and he goes, "Any questions for Matt?" And there were a couple of questions, and I answered them. And he looks at it and goes, "Go make it happen, Matt." And so I walked out. I grabbed my manager, like, "I'm sorry, Lorraine. I did not mean to take over that meeting." She goes, "No, that was perfect. That was perfect." And what I realized was I had this genuine self-confidence of, being in a room with people who were much more senior than I in the organization. But it didn't bother me. I was there to solve a problem because of my expertise. And they relied on me, and I relied on my expertise. And because of that, I got a 3-level promotion to the equivalent of a director level on the technology track as an internal IT consultant about 4 months later.
That's stunning. Want to unpack a little bit of this because for folks that might be at the beginning of their career or thinking about their careers a couple of stages down the road, it's important to hear some of what you're talking about, and they may not be aware of the implications of what you're saying. First of all, let's dig a little bit deeper into the whole evaluation process. Matt, I'll be honest with you. The first time I had a staff person, they gave me some work that I was really unhappy with. And I made my feeling states about that work product clear in no uncertain terms. And I remember telling a coworker about it, and she said, "Scott, I can't believe that's how you responded to that." And I never really thought about it. I was like, well, he didn't give me what I wanted. It wasn't good enough. All that sort of stuff. Not understanding the impact that could have on my career. And it took me a long time without Toastmasters to gradually figure that out. It sounds to me a little bit like you almost had a shortcut through a lot of the hard lessons that I learned. But talk to me about that, and talk to me about whether you can relate to anything I said or someone who might have been in your position, what they might be thinking you're going through.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I relate. I think growing up, you take a look at our schooling, the way we're taught in public schools, private schools, it is all corrective action based. When you're on a sports team, the majority of the work your coach is doing is corrective action based. So we grow up with this expectation that that's what we need to do. And especially when I was growing up in the 80s, coaches like Bobby Knight, Earl Bruce were still around, who were old school coaches, and praise was very hard to come by. Now, we've learned a lot since then, and what psychologists tell us is you actually need 6 positive statements to overcome the impact of 1 negative statement. And the sandwich technique, which we teach in Toastmasters, is actually not the best way, especially in an employment situation. So what you have to do is constantly find ways to praise people. So then when you do have to have that critical conversation, they know that you respect them, they know that you appreciate them, and they can take the negative, like, "You really let me down here." They can take that because they've had the reinforcing positives around it. And so I think that's really what it comes to. And that's why I think the best evaluators have abandoned the sandwich technique of, here's what you did well, here's something to improve, and here's something else you did well. And they've gone into more of a holistic approach. Here's a lot of things you've done well, okay? And here's one or two things that I'd like to see you improve on for the next speech, because it gives us focus on what we need to improve, but it also is surrounded by the positive, uplifting, psychologically beneficial information. So you can really sit there and go, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, the sandwich technique is interesting that you mentioned that and favoring a more holistic approach, because one other thing I've noticed about the sandwich technique, and I'm curious as to whether you have thoughts about this, is that it has entered the popular lexicon to such an extent that people know when it's happening. And so if they hear that first little bit of praise and there hasn't been a larger holistic positive conversation going on, they're prepared for the negative, and then they hear the positive and they're like, oh, I've just been sandwiched, and it throws a lot of the positive out. Or is it just me thinking that?
No, I've been there. I remember one of my bosses come to me and he started off with the positive. It's like, Matt, I really appreciate your work on this. I was like, okay, what's coming up next? Well, that's coming up next. He's like, but Matt, this thing you did last week, you really let me down. And let's be honest, I knew I had let him down. I knew when I turned it in, it wasn't my best work. Okay, for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into. So I was expecting the conversation. Mm-hmm. And he started to give me the praise at the end, and I stopped him. I get it. You need me to fix this. Mm-hmm. He's like, yeah. I said, okay, good. Can we get on with the platitude so I can go fix this? And he looked at me and he just laughed. He goes, yeah, you got it. And I went and I fixed it. It took me a couple days. I fixed it. I came back. And all was good. But I didn't need that lack of authenticity at the end. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it came across to me. It was inauthentic, because I could see in his mind, okay, I got to find something to praise him for. I just hit him hard. Okay. Right. But he had given me enough praise on other items that for him to just come and go, Matt, you really let me down on this. How can we fix it? Would be fine, because it was surrounded by a relationship, a business relationship where I knew that I was appreciated, I was valued, I was a core part of the team. And yeah, I messed up, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it, but he was going through the routine of how to do that. Yeah.
Right. Anytime you feel like you're part of a process, in my experience, you feel a little bit dehumanized, even if the process is nice.
Yeah, the process is nice because, why do banks put queues in? Okay? They're dehumanizing, but what do? The studies actually show, and I think it was back in the 70s, they did a study and it showed that people will wait longer in a queue that they figure is fair than they will if it's just an open thing. Mm-hmm. Because they're like, okay, I know there's 3 people in front of me. Okay. Queues actually take longer. Studies have shown in supermarkets that queuing people to one central point and then fanning them out actually takes longer because of that extra walk time that you have. But people perceive it as fair. So that's what a process can help with a fairness. But when you're dealing with people and their own behavior, it's a different story.
Right. Matt, you said earlier that when you had that conversation with your boss, you were expecting the criticism, and then you saw the sandwich, the pieces of toast, for lack of a better word, mastering your evaluation. Let me ask you, do you think that the evaluation component of Toastmasters, which really is one of the fundamental elements of the entire educational program, has that changed your relationship with self-evaluation as well as your evaluation of others?
Well, yeah, I think the most damaging talk most of us ever receive is self-talk. Shad Helmstetter wrote a book, basically it's what to say when you talk to yourself. That's really what I would call it. What do you say when you talk to yourself? Because we are quite often our harshest critics, even if we live in a world of delusion. Because what happens in our mind? All right. Yeah. Okay. So let me think about a situation here I was in. Okay. So we had a situation at a company I was working for, and one system went down, and we were worried about that spreading to other systems because it looked like it might be a security issue. And all of a sudden, my mind went to the entire data center is going to like burn to the ground. Mm-hmm. Okay. And how did I do? Oh, I messed this up. All right. But then we looked into it, we've pulled it back. And it took the team coming together and going, wait a second, no, this is good. This is good. This is going to stop that. And we were able to isolate it to one machine. But in my mind, I was already beating myself up for burning down the entire data center when we had one machine infected and we didn't know if it was going to go any further. Yeah. And I think we do that to ourselves. You get turned down on a date and nobody loves me. No girl likes me. We meet a new person at work and they don't hit it off with you before. I don't have any friends at work. Okay. I've gotten to this point in my life where, if you don't like me, I'm okay. You're missing out on a pretty good guy, but I know I am surrounded with people who love me and appreciate me. And I don't need you to love me. I would appreciate it. I would like that, but I don't psychologically need it. And I think that's where our self-evaluation comes in, because we put ourselves in a position of need for other people, in a position of need for our own self-approval. And so, yeah, it has changed the way I look at myself, because I really have gotten to this point where, it's this weird space of liking yourself and still wanting to be better. And before I was, I need to get better, so I don't really like who I am. And it's a self-acceptance of who you are, still knowing, I can get better. But if I live the rest of my life as I am right now, I'm okay.
Do you think that process impacts your ability to be a leader?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things leaders have to have is forgiveness. Yeah. Because people on your team will let you down. It will happen. Yeah. Even the brightest superstar you got on your team will let you down. Yeah. But if you put in yourself the position, which is what I do, and some people say it's delusional, and maybe it is, but it works for me. You know what? Scott's doing the best he can. Given his experience, given what's going on in his life right now, given his education, he's doing the best he can, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I'm going to assume the best intent from him until he proves to me otherwise. And I find that a much happier way to live, because yes, do some people let me down? Absolutely. But I'm not going in assuming they're going to let me down. I'm going in prepared for them to let me down, but not assuming.
Which beautifully circles back to the whole discussion we had at the beginning of this sidebar about the nature of the evaluation process and how you approach evaluation. Let's talk for a second about that awesome incident where you wrote on the whiteboard and the next thing you knew, you were ruling the world.
Not quite, okay.
But, we're talking about living in delusion, so that's like a fun delusion. Matt, I will be honest, looking at you, talking to you, you don't strike me as someone who's been facing confidence issues. How can you seriously sit up and tell me that Toastmasters had given you the confidence to stand up there and have that whole thing happen? What on earth, what are you talking about?
When you see the finished product, or, a product that's closer to being finished, we have a building here in my town. So it's about a mile from me. It was actually the first building I ever stepped foot in Coral Springs, Florida, when I moved here, because the realtor that we were working with had her office in that building. And this building has been coming down slowly. They've been using the crane to bring it down because they're building this whole new facility there. And it was just this slow process. They didn't do one of those massive explosions. They were bringing it down piece by piece. And I'm watching it come down. All of a sudden, I'm like, oh my God, it's gone. And it was, the building actually collapsed in on itself earlier than they thought it would.
Wow.
I've seen the video, but it's like all of a sudden it was like everything's here. Yeah, there's holes in it. Yes, it's coming down floor by floor, and all of a sudden, boom, it's gone. And now I know exactly the same thing's going to happen on the other side. They're going to put the foundation in. We're not going to see anything. There's going to be a hole in the ground. And it's going to be like that forever. For those of you in District 46, when you watched the new tower come up after the Twin Towers were down, it felt like nothing was happening forever. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait a second. There's a building there. And it's the same thing. So you look at this end product and you can't imagine where they came from. I can tell you, I was really hard on myself growing up. And because of that, I suffered from something I think a lot of people do, which is this perfectionism. And what perfectionism is in my mind, in my experience, is just really a unwillingness to accept that you have flaws. And the irony is that the only thing that's perfect is something that's imperfect, because perfection doesn't exist in most cases. So when you see this finished product, and my particular issue, so in 2014, I ran for international director in Kuala Lumpur, and I was not successful. And when I came out of it, I started asking people why, because I had this vision of sitting on the board, maybe going further. And so people came out of it. I was like, why? And they're like, well, Matt, we can tell you're a smart guy, but who are you? So the way my self-confidence had manifested itself is I built this barrier up between me and other people. So to keep them out emotionally. And I thought it was protecting myself because of something that happened in high school where a bunch of my friends beat up on me verbally for about 30 minutes telling me I was worthless. And so I built these walls up to keep people out. And I talked to some of my closest friends. One of my closest friends is in Melbourne, Australia. We met in Toastmasters at an international convention. And I called her up and I'm like, Catherine, did you see this barrier? She goes, oh yeah, I saw this barrier. She goes, but I knew there was something about you I really wanted to connect with. So I just came through it and you weren't going to stop me.
Wow.
Most people won't do that.
Yeah.
And when I let that barrier down and became okay, and a lot of it because of Toastmasters, with who I am, that's genuine self-confidence. That's not braggadocio. That's not arrogance. That's, you know what? I'm pretty good at this. Are there people who are better? Absolutely. But I'm pretty good at this and I can make a difference here. And that was where that confidence came in at that moment, was I was sitting there going, yeah, everybody in that room had more experience than me as a leader in the organization. But none of them had the current technical skills to address the issue. They had the mindset. They had the philosophical approach of how to do that. But I knew exactly what needed to be done on a technical level, which is what that problem called for. And when I realized that, I'm like, yes, I belong in this meeting or I wouldn't be here. And before I've sat in meetings, like, why am I here? Why was I invited? I bet you have. You've been in a meeting like, what's the point of me being here? Well, you're there for a reason, and be okay with that and be willing to jump in. We see that on the board with new members who've been elected. Some of them are hesitant to speak up. And I always tell them, no, you were elected to make decisions for the organization. We need to hear your perspective.
As before, you're throwing out stuff that is so rich and lends itself to so much analysis and interesting discussion. So I'm going to try and just pick apart a few themes, hear your thoughts about it. First of all, when you were talking about perfectionism generally, it reminds me of one of the things that I love about Toastmasters personally. And again, all of this, I want your reactions on. Candid. Speech itself is not only a technical skill, but when you were talking about perfectionism, I realized it is actually a powerful metaphor as well. Think about the icebreaker speech. I don't know about you, but me and so many Toastmasters, including someone I just interviewed the other day for this podcast, said that when they did their first speech, that icebreaker speech, they write down every word and they spent ages memorizing it to the letter. Perfectionism in action. Yet that person, who I spoke to, myself, others that I know in Toastmasters, sometime later, just stand up and start talking. Yes, they may do a general outline, but they are freed from the constraints, I view, of perfectionism, of having it be all mega prepared, with the confidence inside that they could stand up in front of a crowd and say something. Do you think that I'm loony when I talk about speech as a metaphor?
No, you're not loony. I have a little different perspective on it. So
share, please.
I speak professionally. I speak to audiences, and at the higher level, you've got to be consistent. And for me, the only way I can be consistent is to prepare like crazy. And to the point where my family is sick of hearing this speech. I'm sick of it, but I know I'm going to deliver on it.
Yep.
From time to, every time it's going to be consistently good. Some days it may be better, but there's a floor at which it will never go under. So,
yeah.
I hear people go, well, I get wooden if I try to memorize my speech. And I'm like, that just means you haven't practiced enough. Because when you talk about freedom, if I don't have to think about the words I'm saying, I have complete freedom to play with the audience. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can go, hey, Scott, boom. And then I go right back to where I was. Where I was like, oh, in District 46, I was talking to Patricia about this the other day. And I don't know what she would think about that. Well, that's not scripted. But everything after that is scripted. So I know I can deliver it.
Yeah.
But it's the space between the prepared speech, the prepared content is good. So the stories I tell, they're gold. I mean, we may have some time to share one of these in a little bit, but these little stories that tell. I think I shared my cross country story. It's about my first cross country race, and I was so prepared, and I ended up finishing 173 out of 173 runners, and I was embarrassed and humiliated. And my dad tells me I need to go back the next day because my team needs me. What? My team doesn't need, I'm like, my team doesn't need me. I finished, I couldn't even see the little girl who finished 172nd. Mm-hmm. And then he says, when you go back tomorrow, no one else has an excuse to quit. Your team needs you. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I share this story and it's 98%, 100% accurate. Okay. There's a little playing, with some of the language and things like that. Sure. But the truth of the story is there. And I can take that story of my first cross-country race, and I can make a dozen different points with that story.
Yeah.
I can talk about, quitters never win and winners never quit. I can talk about failing and then succeeding. Yeah. I mean, there's so many, but the one that resonates with Toastmasters is the leadership lesson of it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you can be a leader in the organization. And we, Toastmasters, needs you to step forward.
What inspired you to move beyond the club level? What inspired you to become the person in Toastmasters that you are today? And why Toastmasters in particular, not any other organization?
So when I get involved with an organization, one of two things happens. I leave very quickly or I get deeply involved. That's just who I am. Mm-hmm. So I've been a 26-year volunteer with the Boy Scouts of America. I've been a Scoutmaster. I've been on the council board. I've taken kids to the National Jamboree in Virginia, to the World Jamboree in London, to the Irish National Jamboree, at hiking in the mountains for 2 weeks in New Mexico, at Philmont Scout Ranch. And so I get deeply involved. I'm in Business Network International, as you mentioned. I'm a director consultant with a support director consultant. So I consult with 3 other chapters because B&I brings in such a high percentage of my business.
Yeah.
So with Toastmasters, what first got me involved was an invitation to get involved outside of the club. Because I think, like most of us, when you join, you're like, okay, this is Toastmasters. This is my club. These are my peeps. This is my 20 people, my 30 people that meet here, and they're cool. And Bob's been doing this, and Susan's been doing that, and Sally came from Taiwan, and I love her stories. And you've got all of these different stories and these different personalities, and they're there to support you. Like, that's amazing. That's just so cool that you've got people from all over the world in many clubs, especially in District 46. That, so much diversity. And you're like, wow, this is awesome. And it kind of takes you out of the realities of the real world for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you get invited to training because you become a club officer. And you're like, oh, wait, there's a bunch of other clubs. Now, in your mind, you know that. But all of a sudden you begin to realize it. And you're like, oh, cool. And there's other people going through what I'm going through and other places. And I could go to a club meeting there and then and here. Wow, that's cool. And then you get invited perhaps to be an area officer, and you're working with clubs. And that was my first role, was an area governor. And I stepped up to be an area governor, and I had a blast. It was one of the most fun roles I've had. And then I became the division governor at the time. And then I went into the district officer roles, the top district officer roles. But what really propelled me on the next step was at a mid-year training outside of Dallas, Texas, about halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth. And there was a woman there named Lark Doley. Now, some of you may be familiar with her name because she was international president just a couple of years ago. And Lark was a region advisor at the time. And at the end of the training, Lark and I had several conversations. I could tell we had connected. And she comes up to me and goes, Matt, have you ever thought about what you're going to do after you're done with your district leadership roles? I said, no, not really. She goes, please start thinking about it. That was it. Just start thinking about it.
Wow.
And that told me she saw something in me. And so I started thinking about it, still keeping in mind that I needed to do the job I was doing right then. Okay. Right. And so that's what inspired me. And I could have stepped down out in 2014 after I lost the election, said, yeah, okay, move on. But I had so many people from the organization who called me within days, who grabbed me after the business meeting and at dinner that night saying, Matt, please run again. Wow. And I was like, okay. And I really did that self-examination and learned the lessons. And I'll tell you this, Scott, the lessons I learned from, not from the failure, but from the reflection on the failure to be elected. Yeah. If I had not learned those lessons, and in fact, if I had won that election, I probably would not have learned those lessons. And I would not be sitting in the executive committee today. I never would have made the executive committee. And so
powerful stuff.
That loss, which hurt. Yes, it hurt. It propelled me forward. And it was the best thing that could have happened for me.
You are an entrepreneur. Yes. And what you just said is a perfect segue into the discussion that I want to have about entrepreneurship, leadership, and Toastmasters. Everyone who is an entrepreneur, well, most people, I don't know about you, maybe this hasn't happened to you, but as an entrepreneur myself, I have failed. I have made so many mistakes. I have done complete face plants, gotten up, cleaned all the mud and other stuff off my face, and had to move on. And you do transform. Talk to me about how you see entrepreneurship in relationship to leadership and what Toastmasters has to offer an entrepreneur as opposed to an emerging executive or large organizational leader.
Well, there are some transferable skills. Okay. So certainly the things you learn about leadership in Toastmasters through taking on roles as a club officer, as a club treasurer, learning to deal with books, learning to lead people when you have no authority over them, learning to influence them, which, many leaders will tell you is the core of leadership is the ability. John Maxwell says, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less.
Yep.
I think there's a little more to it, but I understand where he's coming from. So I think the thing you have to do is you have to learn to lead yourself. And that's the missing ingredient for many in Toastmasters, is they don't realize that they've been leading themselves. Because there's nobody in Toastmasters who's going, Scott, we put you on the schedule, and if you don't do it, you're out of the club. If you say, well, I can't make that, okay. And a lot of clubs don't even schedule. Probably half the clubs just take volunteers, and there's nothing wrong with that. They both work, in my opinion. So you're learning to lead yourself. It is a self-paced environment. Because the one thing I think that entrepreneurs miss, and this is not something the Toastmasters bring to you, but entrepreneurship requires discipline. It requires self-discipline. It's like saying, I don't care I've gotten 14 no's today. I'm picking up the phone. I'm making that 15th call because maybe it's going to be the person who gets me that stuff, and there's this person there's this person I don't want to deal with, but I've got to deal with them, and that self-discipline to do what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, regardless of how you feel about it, is something that sometimes happens in Toastmasters through your leadership positions. I'll share a story with you. When I was doing my videos for my campaign as second vice president, I'm a biker. I love to go out and bike. And one day I went out to the local park to bike, and I get on my bike, and within seconds it starts raining. So it's just raining, and there's no lightning. And my first thought is, let me just go back. I'll get back in the car. I'll bike tomorrow. And I remembered something my dad used to tell me. He's like, well, if you do that, will it help you achieve your goals? And I had set a goal, and I was like, wait, no, it won't. So I stayed out, and I finished riding the bike. And I got back, and I am soaking wet. And I'm like, I need to do a video right now about leadership and doing the uncomfortable. So I do this little video about how sometimes to meet your goals, you've got to be willing to get uncomfortable. And I mean, it was clear I was uncomfortable. And so I sent it to my campaign manager to watch. And Andy says back, he goes, he just watched the video. He didn't listen to it. He goes, Matt, you can't put that up. You look terrible. You don't look happy. And I'm like, go back and listen to it. He listened to it. It's like, oh my God, that was great. That was great. And I put it up, and it was the one I got the most comments on. Now, what was interesting is then I followed it up with the consequences of that. Because when you bike in the rain, if there's any bikers out there, they know when you bike in the rain, your bike gets dirty. Yes. So the next video I did was me cleaning the bike after the bike ride. And I talked about the fact that it's like integrity. Some parts of it are really easy to get clean, but sometimes you really got to get it in there with a toothbrush and really get that grit out of there, because it's going to destroy the bike if you don't, especially it's going to destroy your chain and your drivetrain. So you've got to get that cleaned up. And that's the same thing. When you fall out of integrity, you've got to get it cleaned up. And so that incident led me to two little videos that really a lot of people commented on during their interviews that they had watched those. So, you've just got to, as an entrepreneur, you've got to be willing to take those risks. And I do think Toastmasters helps you with risk taking. But that discipline piece, if you embrace the discipline in Toastmasters of saying, you know what, I want to complete level 3 this year. In order for me to do that, I need to do this. I need to do this. I need to do this. And you do that with no excuses and don't accept excuses. You'll do it. And my son works with me. He's 31 years old now. And I remember when he was going through the Scout program, he graduated from Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts, and he's like, I want to be an Eagle Scout. And that's a big deal in the Scouts, because less than 3% of kids earn their Eagle rank. And he wrote down a chart with every merit badge he had to earn, with every requirement he had to do, and he put dates on them. And I was like, okay, this is a little obsessive. You know, you're 11 years old. You're just becoming an eagle. You're going to do that. Well, then he gets sick on a camping trip. Okay. He gets sick before a camping trip and he can't go on the camping trip. And he pulls out his chart and he adjusts his dates because he got sick and he wasn't good. I'm like, oh my God, I want to hire this guy. You know,
I was going to say, I'm full of both terror and admiration.
Exactly.
It's incredible.
You know, so those types of things, that discipline, I think, is the missing ingredient. But I have seen so many people. The other missing ingredient, I'll put it this way, is your significance. So this is a great experiment to do in a Toastmasters club. Bring your tissue box. Okay, bring multiple tissue boxes. And what you do is you do a meeting and it's all table topics. And you put everyone's name in a hat. And everyone draws a name. And you just make sure it's not your own name. And then the entire meeting is Scott gets up and says, this is why I'm glad Patricia's in our club.
Wow.
And then Patricia gets up and goes, this is why I'm glad Bob's in our club. 1 to 2 minutes all the way around. You will have tears. You will have people just so inspired by what they've heard. Because most people don't realize what their own significance is, that value they have that brings it into them. And when people see that, that's when they ask that woman out or that man out. They decide to start a business. They decide to apply for a promotion at work. They decide, like I did, to leave a 6-figure job at a Fortune 200 company and take something that's very simple of doing these tasks and getting paid for it and turn it into something very complex and much more risky of trying to start a business for much less money to begin with. And without Toastmasters and that self-confidence, without Toastmasters and people sharing that, and it's not all Toastmasters experiments, but Toastmasters was the, I'll go old school here. It was the kiln that forged that. You know, if you've ever worked with pottery, you know, you put the pottery in the kiln to harden it. And that's what it is. You put all the ingredients in, and Toastmasters helps you create something that is new and unique, but still you. And you're just maybe a little more self-realized, a little more self-confident. And that's all it takes for you to take the next step in your personal journey.
Matt, what are you going to tell your 11-year-old son to get him into Toastmasters?
No, so my 31-year-old son is double.
I'm sorry, 31. What would you have is he in Toastmasters?
Since the day he turned 18.
And how did you get him in there?
That's a funny story. So I was the equivalent of the club growth director. So the role that Evelyn Marrero had this year. And we had a district conference in I believe it was Sarasota, Florida. And our sound engineer backed out at the last minute for some personal reason. Okay. He wasn't upset with us. He just could not make it. Now, my son had been running the soundboard at church for several years as part of the youth group. And he would run the soundboard at church during the day. So he knew what to do. And I think he was 16 at the time. And so I called the district governor and I said, Rick, Brandon can come over. I said, but, he said he can't afford it. And Rick's like, we'll cover his costs. We'll put him up in a hotel room. I'm like, well, he can stay in our room. He's like, okay, great. Because I was part of the district trio. So my room was covered as part of the expenses. And he came over there and he ran the sound for us. And then he got called the next year to run the sound. So he had been to 3 district conferences before he turned 18. And so he had no choice but to join because it wasn't us doing it. It was everybody else. And I remember someone asked me the other day, what was one of my proudest moments in Toastmasters? And I was like, the day I got introduced to somebody as, oh, this is Brandon's father. Because I realized, wait a second. Now, I was used to that in Scouts because Scouts, all that. But in Toastmasters, it was always, oh, that's Matt's son. That's Matt and Janine's son. But we got introduced as Brandon's parents. And I was like, wow, he's created his own name for himself. He's standing on his own and people know he's associated with us, but he's his own person in Toastmasters. He's not just an extension of us now. And that was a really cool moment. And he's earned his DTM. He's almost complete with his second DTM. He was a pathways guide for us, area governor for us, area director. I think he was membership retention chair last year for the district. So he's still quite involved, and he loves Toastmasters. He's been a club president.
Yeah, I'm hearing that he might share your tendency to, when he gets involved in something, get really involved in something.
Personality-wise, though, he's very different. He's an introvert. He's a complete introvert. I'm actually right on the line between introvert and extrovert. I'm right square in the middle. Some people call that an ambivert, but he's an introvert. He'll go home for the weekend and not talk to anybody, not leave his house, and then he usually works from home on Monday, so I won't see him until Tuesday, and he's perfectly fine with that.
Yeah, that's wow. Matt, tell me the name of one leader that you admire and why, and one speaker that you admire and why.
When I look at leaders, what I look at are a couple of characteristics. And so there are multiple people who meet this. But I look at somebody who had a vision and also had the courage to change their tactics to have that vision occur. So Abraham Lincoln did not start the Civil War thinking that we needed to resolve the issue of slavery. He changed his mind and changed his tactics. Martin Luther King looked at Gandhi and said, hey, there's a different way, but he changed his tactics throughout. Gandhi started out as a militant when he was living in South Africa, and he was very combative with the constabulary in South Africa. And when he went back to India, because of his experience there, that's when he adopted a way of peaceful resistance, of passive resistance. And so they not only had this vision of making the world a better place, but they had the courage to change their tactics to keep their goal alive. And I think sometimes leaders get stuck on their tactics. Speakers I admire, Bill Gove, the late Bill Gove, is just one of the best speakers I've ever seen. And he would probably never win a Toastmasters contest because he's got ums and ahs, and he looks like he forgets things. It's all stagecraft, and he's just a master at it. But currently, the leader, there's a couple. Jocko Willink, I just love his message. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he's talking about extreme ownership. But the stories he tells are great. Steve Siebold, who's a mental toughness expert. Again, what I look for in speakers is this ability to tell stories and make points. And really, they're telling the stories to keep me entertained long enough so they get a chance to make their point. And I may not remember their point, but I do remember their stories for years. And so those are ones. And then probably the one who's having the most impact today, I would say, and I think many of you are familiar with him, is Simon Sinek. He's having a huge impact today because he's got a different perspective on leadership. He's got a different perspective on the way people work together, on why people do things. And I think it's a message that's very pertinent to today.
Yeah. In this moment in particular. Matt, it has been great having you on the show today. Thank you for joining us, for sharing your story and so many brilliant insights. For those of you listening or watching, if you enjoyed today's episodes, be sure to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. And don't forget to follow District 46 on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. If you're new to Toastmasters, check out Toastmasters46.org. That's Toastmasters46.org to learn more about us or to visit one of our clubs. Toastmasters is where leaders are made.
Thank you so much for joining us on Transformational Pathways. If you enjoyed today's episode or got anything out of it, please rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're interested in learning more about Toastmasters District 46, check out the link in the show notes below.